Hello everybody, welcome back. I'm not gonna apologize for the hiatus this time, but I will explain it. 3 weeks ago, my daughter was born. It is a magical and wonderful time, but also an incredibly trying time because I am watching my 2-year-old son now all the time, and that, my goodness, is a full-time job and a half. Anyway, it's been tough to find time for this, but I have been sitting on this script for a while. I'd like to get the video out. Trust me, I'm thinking about you guys. And once I'm past this troubled phase, we will be back to our extremely productive, around once a month cadence. Thank you guys for your patience. You're the best audience on YouTube. I am convinced of that fact. So welcome back. You will notice that I am outside. I hope this is acceptable to y'all. I feel like it's somewhat appropriate for the book that we're going to be discussing. My office is in a state of disarray, so this is what we're stuck with. For those of you who are new here, my name is Marcello. I talk about books with a focus on 90s YA for some reason, pretty much exclusively Animorphs so far. In this series of videos, I am summarizing the Animorphs books, analyzing them to whatever small degree I am capable of, and assigning a very specific ranking to each book. I'm trying to approach this reread of the series with an open mind and consider each book anew rather than relying on my nostalgic interpretations of the ones that I'm more familiar with. I've read the series through twice in its entirety, by the way, with a small collection of childhood books that I've read like 50 times each. This video will focus on The Change, the 13th book in the series, a Tobias book, and one of my eternal favorites, not just like favorite Animorphs books. This was a formative book for me. I don't know if my love for sci-fi would exist without this book. Suffice it to say, this book moved me at 10 years old. I have summarized it before in my Tragedy of Tobias series, but this is a new summary after rereading the book yet again. The front cover quote of this book is "Be afraid," and the inside front cover quote is "It was only a dream." Or was it? I have a good piece of trivia for this one, courtesy of Seropedia, as usual. Dave Mattingly, the illustrator for the first run of Animorphs book, actually put a copy of one of his books on Tobias's shelf for the inside cover illustration. Another fun thing is that they start referring to Tobias as Dirty Blonde instead of Blonde in this book because his model is not blonde at all. They do a lot of altering of characters' appearances based on what models they could get, I've noticed. They did it for Marco with his hair as well. Small note to self, maybe I can add this to my list of videos to make. So apparently this book came out at the same time as the Andalite Chronicles, which, spoiler alert, reveal Tobias's true parentage, and I am glad that it took me a few years to find the Andalite Chronicles because I would have absolutely lost my mind if I had read it at the same time as The Change. Okay, enough preamble, let's start the summary. In the first chapter of this book, Tobias spends a lot of time describing his physical appearance and the dissonance between how he appears and who he actually is on the inside. In the very first scene, Tobias is hunting and he kills a mouse, which is clearly there to show us that the conflict that Tobias faced in the last book that he narrated is over. He has grown. He kills and eats mice now, and it is not a problem for him. As Tobias eats his mouse in some tree somewhere, he sees a magazine that someone has thrown away, and the wind blows its pages open until it lands on a page of a classroom full of kids, just like Tobias was once. What a heavy-handed introduction. No wonder I liked Tobias books so much throughout my childhood and adolescence. The imagery of Tobias, this mean-looking hawk with the mind of a sensitive teenage boy, eating a mouse alone in a tree while being forced to look at an image of what his life once was. It's a sad scene, for sure, but in the next chapter, Tobias tells us that he accepts that this is his life now, and that it has its perks, namely that he can fly. There are a lot of other perks to Tobias's Nothlit status, by the way. His human life was never fantastic, as he mentions all the time. There's a contingent of people who believe that Tobias actually got trapped in the red-tailed hawk morph on purpose, but as of right now, I don't believe this theory. I think it is possible that he acted very recklessly, knowing that this was a potential consequence and not fully thinking through its impact on him, but I don't think that there was a point at like an hour and 59 minutes where Tobias had the opportunity to demorph and consciously chose not to. I think he sort of just let it happen at most. This may be a longer video than usual, by the way. It seems like I have a lot to say about this book. So, Tobias flies around for a bit. He says hi to Axe. He finds the rest of the group at school and spies on them for a little bit through the windows before finally finding Rachel, who has a very dramatic entrance with wind blowing in her sun-dappled hair, etc. Rachel is walking to the gym for a thing, and Tobias sees a piece of paper in her hand. The paper says that Rachel's been named a Packard Foundation Outstanding Student, and Tobias is about to congratulate her when he sees that there's some kind of award ceremony on Friday that he won't get to go to because he's a hawk. Tobias realizes that Rachel Rachel has intentionally kept this from him and has some feelings about that. Tobias and Rachel agree to meet after school to talk about Tobias's Yeerk pool mapping project, which is much cooler and more important than the Packard Award, in my opinion. But Tobias is still sad, and as he flies away, he thinks about whether or not he would turn back into a boy if he had the chance. Later, Tobias meets Rachel in a bald eagle morph in the sky. She tells him that he doesn't need to do extra work just because of his, condition, but Tobias kind of ignores her. Tobias has an obvious need to feel useful, and I wonder whether that's driven from a place of hubris or, nobility and righteousness. I guess because he's Elfangar's son, you would assume that he would have inherited some of the nobility, right? Although Elfangar was kind of proud as well. The Andalites in general are a very proud people, so I guess there's a lot of questions there. Tobias congratulates Rachel on her award, and Rachel reacts awkwardly, and Tobias tells her not to keep things from him anymore because he doesn't want her to feel sorry for him. I guess it is probably hubris that drives Tobias to do his little Yeerk pool mapping mission and all of his side quests then. With this awkwardness out of the way, Tobias takes Rachel on a flying tour of the Yeerk pool entrances around their town. This is a lovely date, and it's a shame that Tobias is stuck in a hawk body. Tobias tells Rachel that they're going to the car wash, but for some reason he keeps spacing out and flying to the same spot at the edge of the woods. Tobias is unnerved by the fact that this keeps happening. He's supposed to be an excellent aerial navigator at this point, when suddenly he sees a huge oak tree simply slide to the side, revealing a dark hole in the ground. As Rachel and Tobias watch, a pair of Hork-Bajir come out of this hole. Tobias notes that they look scared before an alarm starts blaring and the Hork-Bajir take off. Soon, a bunch of dirt bikes drive out of the hole in pursuit of the Hork-Bajir. The controllers on bikes shoot at the Hork-Bajir with assault rifles, and Tobias interferes by speaking to the Hork-Bajir in Thoughtspeak, obviously, and guiding them through their escape. As he does so, he finds that the Hork-Bajir may not be intelligent enough to follow his commands, and Tobias flies down in front of them and asks them to follow him. There's a lot of action, read the books, and one of the Hork-Bajir winds up escaping while the other one falls down into a ditch somewhere. Later, the gang is in Cassie's barn with Tobias and Rachel debriefing them on the great Hork-Bajir escape. The male Hork-Bajir is safe in a cave, and the group decides to go talk to him. You're gonna hear my neighbors doing some yard work, apparently. That's fine. So Tobias and Axe go in alone at first, in case the Hork-Bajir is actually part of some Yeerk trap. They don't want to reveal that they are humans to him. The Hork-Bajir reacts with fear at the sight of Axe because the primary experience for these Hork-Bajir with Andalites is that Andalites kill them. It's interesting that their relationship with an entire species would be almost entirely created through interactions that the Hork-Bajir have had while enslaved by the Yeerks. I know that the Andalites and the Hork-Bajir had a separate thing going on. I've read the Hork-Bajir Chronicles, thank you everybody. But in terms of the day-to-day experience of your average Hork-Bajir, they have come to fear the same thing that their Yeerk hosts fear. They don't get to have personal experiences with the world anymore. This also reminds us that every time that an Animorph has killed a Hork-Bajir controller, they are killing a scared, innocent, not very bright Hork-Bajir who is trapped in his own mind. The rest of the Animorphs enter the scene in battle morphs, and the Hork-Bajir named Jarahami proves that he is not a controller by slicing into his own head with one of his blades and showing them his bare brain. No Yeerk. The Animorphs agree that Jarahami is not a controller, and Jarahami asks if they will help him find his wife. They're all interrupted at this point by Cassie, who has appeared in Owlmorph. Cassie tells them that she has noticed a number of Yeerk search parties traversing the woods, obviously in search of the escaped Hork-Bajir. The Animorphs decide that one of them will morph Jarahami, with his permission of course, and then distract the Yeerks so that the real Jarahami can escape. Jarahami doesn't really give his permission, for the record. They kind of just explain the plan to him, and he says that he hates Yeerks, and they take that as consent. So Rachel morphs the Hork-Bajir. She has some kind of aggression ritual with the real Jarahami, then she gains control of herself. Jake instructs Jarahami to hide in the cave, and the Yeerks show up. Tobias grabs onto Rachel's horn blade with his talons, and Rachel takes off. Cassie guides them from above as they run through the woods when Tobias suddenly finds himself transported to an entirely different part of the forest. Beneath him, he sees another Hork-Bajir surrounded by men with guns, one of whom demorphs into Visser 3. Tobias then creates a scene, attacking Visser 3's stalk eyes, and helps the new Hork-Bajir escape. So this was not a vision like Jake had a few books ago. Tobias legitimately was transported to another part of the forest. Later, the two Hork-Bajir are reunited, and the group discusses their situation. Rachel says that she will be grounded if she's home late, and Tobias makes a passive-aggressive remark about the Packard Award, which makes everyone feel a little bit awkward. The group decides that Tobias and Axe will keep watch over the cave with the two Hork-Bajir, and they contemplate what to do with them. Tobias is suddenly struck with an idea. An image just pops into his head of a place in the forest that will be safe from Yeerks, where the Hork-Bajir will have everything that they need. And Tobias tells the rest of the Animorphs about this place. The only problem, Tobias thinks to himself, is that he has never been there before and has no idea where this image came from. He does not share this information with the group. At this point, the rest of the Animorphs go home, and Tobias goes to perch outside the cave. We are then treated to a monologue about how tough it is at night as a hawk worrying about predators. There's a lot in this book to remind us of how hard Tobias's life is, but it doesn't really feel overdone. At least, not yet. I'll, keep tabs on it. Axe shows up, and he tells Tobias that the Hork-Bajir are not a very intelligent species, and asks Tobias about the valley that he described to the group earlier. Tobias asks Axe if Axe ever had images randomly pop into his head, and as he's asking him this, another image pops into Tobias's head, this time of taxons searching through the forest. Tobias tells Axe about the image that he just saw of the taxons, and Axe confirms that taxon trackers would be a viable option for the Yeerks at this point. Tobias now realizes that someone is probably putting these images into his head somehow, and he resolves to find out what is going on before going to wake the two Hork-Bajir. Jarahami asks where they're going, and Tobias says that maybe the little voice in his head will tell him. Jarahami then tells Tobias that he has also heard a voice in his head that told him to run while he was at the Yeerk pool, resulting in his escape. The voice also told him that it would send a guide. This is Tobias. At this point, Tobias stops their little caravan in its tracks, and he says he's not going another step until he finds out what's going on. He is then transported into space, where he floats in human form, and the Ellimist, of course, talks to him. The Ellimist shows up in the shape of a bird of prey, and there's a lot of imagery that's symbolic of Tobias's identity, with Tobias and the Ellimist's shapes changing between bird and human. I suggest reading the book, as usual, because the writing here is pretty good, and I'm not doing it justice in my recap. The Ellimist confirms that he wants Tobias to help the Free Hork-Bajir, and Tobias tells the Ellimist that he wants something in return. When the Ellimist asks what, Tobias says that he already knows. This is a critical point. Tobias is then transported back to the forest. So, just to confirm, it is implied that Tobias wants to be human again. But what kind of human is an important question here, because if the choice would be to be human again without the power to morph, or to be Hawk but still have the power to morph, and to be able to morph human, I would 100% choose the latter. So I guess my point is that in Tobias's case, I would want to be very specific with the Ellimist about what I wanted, lest I be stuck in human form without the ability to morph at all. Because think about it. At least now Tobias has the autonomy, the freedom to do what he wants as a Hawk. As a vanilla human, he wouldn't be able to do his Yeerk pool mapping project, he'd always be at risk of being made a controller, he'd need a house to stay in, he'd need to pay rent or something. Yeah, I would want to be very specific with the Ellimist if I were in Tobias's shoes, and I am so confused at why he chooses not to be. I mean, I'm not that confused. Tobias is like emo and emotionally driven, and I guess he's just so fed up with everything and the Ellimist's manipulation of him that he feels like he is owed whatever he wants, and he shouldn't even need to explain himself. But when you assume, you make an ass of you and me. Anyway, the walk through the woods continues until the Hork-Bajir get hungry, and they stop and they eat some tree bark. Tobias is struck by the fact that, in their natural form, the Hork-Bajir are not predators. For such fearsome-looking creatures, they are gentle herbivores, and this makes their enslavement by the Yeerks all the more tragic, and again sheds a new light on the wake of carnage that the Animorphs have been leaving behind them in this series. So Tobias flies off for a few minutes to hunt while the Hork-Bajir are eating, and he winds up engaged in combat with a random bobcat. Tobias attempts to use his human cunning to escape, but he fails, and he's about to be eaten anyway when a taxon shows up and eats the bobcat. Tobias flies away, noting the size of the Yeerk force, which includes Hork-Bajir and taxons, out in broad daylight, and Tobias thinks to himself that the Yeerks obviously will stop at nothing to get these escaped Hork-Bajir. On his way back to the aforementioned Hork-Bajir, Tobias runs into the rest of the gang. They tell him that they suspect that the Ellimist is involved in these shenanigans, and Tobias confirms that this is definitely the case. Rachel sends Tobias a private thought-speak message asking if he's okay, and Tobias tells her that the Ellimist promised to make him human again, which I will note that he did not. The group reunites with the Free Hork-Bajir to brainstorm what to do in the face of the massive Yeerk force pursuing them. Jarahami says that he would rather be dead than enslaved again, which prompts the Animorphs to assume their human forms in front of them, in a show of trust. With that, they embark into the woods under Tobias's guidance to the valley that he has never been to before, but that he cannot get out of his head. A few hours later, the group is traversing some mountains, apparently, when Tobias slips away to snag a mouse off the forest floor. Afterwards, he sees that the Yeerks have now employed helicopters in their search, and if they continue, they will soon see the Animorphs in their human forms with the Hork-Bajir climbing this mountain. To be critical for just a second, why didn't the Animorphs just morph wolves and run with the Hork-Bajir? Surely that would have been better than staying in their human bodies. Anyway, Tobias is frantically flying back to the group, trying to warn them to get off the trail, to morph, when he is hit by a gust of wind generated by one of the helicopter's propellers. This causes Tobias to hit a branch, breaking his wing. A raccoon picks Tobias up at this point, and he is about to eat him when the Ellimist's disembodied voice rings through Tobias's head. He asks Tobias if he wants his reward now, his repayment in exchange for being used. Tobias says that he does, and the Ellimist says it is done. Tobias, however, is still a bird. Okay, flies, come on. The Ellimist prompts him to use the power that Elfangor gave him, which causes Tobias to fly into a rage, calling the Ellimist a liar and a cheat before focusing on and acquiring the raccoon. Again, I will point out, Tobias did not directly ask for anything, and also the Ellimist didn't agree to anything. I am not like an Ellimist apologist, at least I don't think I am, maybe I am, I don't know. There are plenty of times that the Ellimist has been up to some circuitous shenanigans and acts duplicitously, but in this case, Tobias has made a lot of assumptions, he has not communicated to the best of his ability, and what the Ellimist gives him is better than what he would have asked for anyway. It's never specified, but I always assumed that Tobias just wanted to be human again, whether or not he got the morphing ability back with his human form. I assume this because he can't morph as a hawk, so if he were magically made human again, why would he assume that he would get this, like, bonus as well? So without being given any clear instruction, the Ellimist chose not to burden Tobias with his human form, and with it the obligation to pay rent and all of the other things that I discussed before. Being a human is expensive, so the Ellimist decides to give Tobias the morphing ability instead, leaving him in his hawk form. How is this not the best case scenario? It could only be better if he could morph into his original human form as well. Alright, let's get back to the plot. So Tobias now has the morphing ability, and he has a raccoon morph, so he morphs raccoon in order to escape being eaten by that same raccoon, and his inner monologue is all just rage at the Ellimist, even though he is wrong, as we have discussed, and as I'm going to discuss again multiple times. I don't know why it bothers me so much in this read. So Tobias runs away in his raccoon form, thinking about how he's going to find his friends again, and then he realizes that he can just morph back into his hawk body and he won't be injured anymore. As he morphs, the narrative says, "Slowly I became myself again," which I took note of because, you know, what is myself for Tobias? I guess a hawk is himself. As he flies, he sees the scope of the Yeerk army and is filled with a sense of hopelessness. The Yeerks are out in full force with Hork-Bajir warriors, armed to the teeth, human controllers, helicopters. As Tobias watches in fear and horror, he sees that the Yeerks have even started a forest fire and are going to use it to try to smoke the free Hork-Bajir out. Eventually, Tobias sees Axe down on the ground and flies down to him. The rest of the Animorphs, as well as the free Hork-Bajir, are soon reunited in the forest and they discuss their predicament. They realize that the Yeerks will not stop their search until the two free Hork-Bajir are captured or dead, and they decide that their best bet will be to fake their deaths by morphing the Hork-Bajir and doing a choreographed fall into a ravine. They need someone to morph Ket, the female of the two Hork-Bajir, and Tobias volunteers, leading Rachel to infer aloud that the Ellimist must have given him the power to morph. Rachel is also angry at Tobias, and the rest of the group shares that anger. Tobias nobly tells them that they shouldn't be mad and that he's a full member of the group again, he'll just be keeping his wings. In light of the fact that Tobias did not actually ask the Ellimist to make him human again, I don't think that this is the noble, self-sacrificing character moment that the book portrays it as. In talking incessantly about how he doesn't want to feel sorry for himself, Tobias basically is just feeling sorry for himself. I know that I'm harping on this a lot. This is coming from a place of love. I love this book, as I said, but it does feel like a little bit much. In any case, Tobias puts his feelings to the side for the time being, and the mission proceeds. As Tobias morphs, Marco and Rachel make some comments, and Tobias once again starts talking about how he can't let himself get mad. Getting mad is not what predators do. Predators are never angry, they're only hungry, and Tobias is a hawk, so he's a predator, so he can't be angry, he can only be hungry, and he'll never be human again. I know that I keep talking about this, but it is every other paragraph that Tobias spends being in his feelings, so I feel like I need to just keep addressing it. Tobias has always struggled with this idea that his identity is that he's either a hawk or a human. His arc in the encounter is basically him coming to terms with the idea that he can be both at once, and that whatever he, Tobias, is, it's greater than like such a simple definition. But it appears now, in his distress, Tobias has regressed a little bit, and he's falling back into his old fatalistic thought patterns. This is fair. Everyone has their moments of weakness, especially in such stress and life-changing circumstances as Tobias is in right now. But in the wake of him not communicating what he actually wanted to the Ellimist, and then misleading the group and getting them mad at the Ellimist too, and then also lying to himself about it, I guess, a little bit, the passive aggression and the self-pity, it just seems like a little bit much right now. Tobias is the architect of his own situation in more ways than I think he is aware of, no matter how much of a realist he thinks he is. So, Tobias is a Hork-Bajir now, along with Rachel, and the mission is underway. Jake is overhead in Peregrine Falcon Morph, directing them. They are trapped between the Yeerk forces on one side, the forest fire on another side, and their only exit is this steep ravine. The Yeerk army and the fire are both closing in, so Rachel and Tobias start making their way through the woods. They come upon two random taxons, and Tobias wants to murder them just for fun, getting his rage out a little bit, and this causes Rachel to tell Tobias to chill out. She tells him that killing the taxons won't help him get back at the Ellimist for betraying him. If I were Jake, by the way, I don't think that I would have let Tobias on this mission. Tobias just got the morphing power back. He is clearly not in a stable mindset. He also has a terrible track record when it comes to time management in Morph. Yeah, I would have insisted, if I were Jake, that I go instead. I would have told Tobias to stay behind and practice morphing raccoon and not freaking out. Or I would have had Tobias where he belongs, where he's used to being, up in the sky, guiding them. Why shake things up at this very critical juncture? Anyway, Rachel and Tobias continue to make their way through the forest. Jake is not doing a great job at playing guide. I guess they do need Tobias up there after all, and eventually they wind up having to fight their way through a little troop of Hork-Bajir in order to get to the edge of the ravine. There is a lot of action here. Jake saves Tobias's life to make up for how bad he is at directing them, and eventually Rachel has her kamikaze jump into the ravine. Tobias is about to follow her when Visser 3 emerges and blocks him. Tobias then runs at Visser 3, clearly intending to tackle him and bring him down into the ravine with him, killing them both, which causes Visser 3 to jump out of the way because Visser 3 is self-serving before he is anything else, including impetuous. Tobias then jumps, and Marco in Gorilla Morph catches him as he falls, pulling him into a cave on the side of the cliff where Rachel is waiting. From this vantage point, Tobias can see the bottom of the ravine where the real Jarahami and Cat Hellpack are laying, playing dead, and a few Animorphs have morphed wolves and are pretending to eat them. Visser 3 enjoys this sight from the top of the cliff before telling everyone to roll out, leaving the wolves to the Hork-Bajir corpses. This is absurd, by the way. If I were Visser 3, I would 100% be making sure that those Hork-Bajir were dead. Even their bodies in the woods are a liability, even if they are eaten by wolves. Their skeletons would remain and could possibly be found one day, and any attention to the possibility of aliens living on Earth here with us would be bad for the Yeerk invasion, especially if it's found in like a mountain pass right outside of a city where the Yeerk's main base of operations is. Also, the presence of the wolves here is like way too convenient. Visser 3 knows that there's a small band of morph-capable Andalites going around trying to foil his plans. It seems like the wolves were just waiting there at the bottom of the ravine to like eat whatever bodies fell out of the sky. This is a very quick reaction time. And also, if they were there eating the first Hork-Bajir, when the second one fell out of the sky and landed right next to them, would that not scare them away for a few minutes? Like, wouldn't they be a little bit suspicious about going back to the place where the giant heavy bodies are falling from the sky? If I were Visser 3, I would have incinerated them right there on the spot. I would have taken the Dracon beam, turned it all the way up, and zapped them. It removed all traces of them. At the very least, I would have asked a few questions. But Visser 3 doesn't do this, so the Animorphs' plan succeeds. Once all the Yeerk troops have moved out, the Animorphs and the Free Hork-Bajir continue on their pilgrimage, eventually arriving at the little secret valley that the Ellimist has injected into Tobias's brain. The Free Hork-Bajir talk about how they want to have kids, it's very cute, and then everyone goes home. Tobias returns to his meadow, ignoring Rachel when she comes to visit him the next day. Tobias is doing his whole "I'm a hawk, I'm a predator, hawks don't hug" thing. That night, Tobias is trying to sleep when he finds himself suddenly transported to his old human bedroom. He's still in his hawk body, and he sees his human self on the bed. There's a calendar on the wall, and Tobias sees that it is the day before he walked into the construction site. Tobias's human self wakes up, and Tobias has a little chat with him, telling his past self to walk through the construction site, and then acquiring his past self before being transported back to the woods. The Ellimist then asks if he kept his promise. Tobias says yes. The Ellimist asks if he's happy, and the chapter ends. The next day, Rachel gets the Packard Award, and Tobias surprises her by showing up in his human form, and the book ends. So I feel like I really rambled a lot for this one, but it is what it is. This has been one of my favorite Animorphs books. This has been my favorite Animorphs book since I was a little bitty boy. I will try to evaluate it without being too biased, but this is one of the best books, nostalgia notwithstanding, so we'll see how it goes. Alright, so my camera overheated while I was filming that about a month ago. So here we are, recording the rating section in the car. It is what it is. This is just what my life is like now. Hello. Anyway, let's get right to it. So for plot, I am giving this book a 10. In spite of Tobias's sort of angsty, like, whining throughout, and in spite of all of the inner monologues, the book does not get weighed down by this at all. It still moves along really quickly. I gave The Forgotten a 10. I gave The Invasion a 10. And this book feels about as fun as those books felt to read. Yeah, this book is a blast. We get introduced to the Free Hork-Bajir. We get to morph Hork-Bajir. For significance, come on, this feels feels like another obvious 10. This isn't my bias speaking. This just is a very significant book. Let's just list the things, okay? Tobias gets the power to morph back. Tobias gets his human form back. We get a Hork-Bajir morph, like I just mentioned. We free some Hork-Bajir, and we create the Hork-Bajir Valley. All of these things independently have far-reaching impacts on the rest of the series. This is obviously a 10 significance book. Honestly, other than the invasion and maybe some of the like very later books, this is, of the early books, maybe the most significant book. For character, I'm giving this book an 8. It's obviously significant for Tobias, but we do have a significance category for that reason. Honestly, I feel like Tobias's entire like Ellimist betrayal arc was a little bit of a regression from him. The way that he reacted to it and the way that he sort of like processed everything and the thoughts that his mind went to, it was very reminiscent of his struggle in book 3, and I just feel like he should have grown maybe a little bit more than he did. Now, I understand that the counter argument to that is that the Ellimist is like an omniscient being, so assuming that the Ellimist knows what Tobias wants isn't that big of a stretch, right? Like, it's a fair assumption to make. But the truth of the matter is, Tobias doesn't actually know what he wants. And so to assume that the Ellimist would know when he himself does not know what he wants, it belies a lack of understanding of yourself. And that's totally fine. Like, Tobias has some growth still that he has to do. I'm giving it an 8. I'm not giving it like a 5. I'm just saying, like, it felt a little bit like maybe he should have already gotten past some of the sort of thoughts that he reverts to in this book. Finally, for writing, K.A. wrote this one. We are giving it an 8. It does the job. You guys know the deal by now. We're getting to the ghostwriter soon, although at the rate of my productivity over the last couple months, we will never be there. But this is just a season of my life, guys. No one's worried. Anyway, this gives us a final score of 9.1 out of 10, putting the change in first place, tied with the invasion. I'm sure that my bias played a decent part in the grading of this book, but earnestly, I cannot figure out how to grade it any lower than I did. So we're just going to call it here. And honestly, that feels kind of fair, because when I think about books that I really enjoyed and books that I consider like kind of critical to the Animorphs series as a whole, the invasion and this book are kind of the two that take that top spot. There are other books that I certainly enjoy reading quite a bit that are maybe less significant or less important to the series as a whole. And there are other books that are critically important to the series that I just don't enjoy as much. And I'm thinking of most of the later books, frankly, although we'll see on this reread if I start enjoying them more. Anyway, that is the ranking for this book. I'm glad that we were able to do it. The channel's been growing quite a bit lately, and it's grown even since I recorded the first part of this and when I recorded the latter part. We are now past 900 subscribers. I'm really grateful for all of you guys. Thanks so much for watching. See you in the next one.